My father didn't just take the house from me that night. He took my name, my history, and every version of the future I had ever imagined for myself. He sat behind his mahogany desk in that Richmond study, his fingers laced together the way they always were when he was about to deliver a verdict, and he looked at me the way a man looks at a vending machine that swallowed his dollar, with mild annoyance. Nothing more. He slid a check across the desk. $100, made out to cash. He told me to take it and disappear. He said that if I repeated what I had found to anyone, to the board, to the auditors, to the press, he would make sure every person in Richmond believed I was a troubled girl who had spent years fabricating stories for attention. He said the Hargrove name was not something I was allowed to drag through the mud just because I had a gift for misunderstanding numbers. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked up that check, folded it once, and slid it into the pocket of my jacket. Then I told him something I meant with every cell in my body. I told him I was very good at numbers. And I never forgot a single one. That was 11 years ago. I was 19 years old. Now I am standing in my office on the 42nd floor of a building in Chicago, looking out at the lake in the early morning dark, when my phone buzzes with a message from my assistant. There are 2 people in the lobby downstairs. They don't have an appointment. The man gave his name as Robert Hargrove. My father. I set down my coffee. I look at the message for a long moment. Then I type back, great back, send them up, and tell building security to stay close. But before I tell you what happened when those elevator doors opened, I want to know you're here with me. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know who is in this room with me tonight. Richmond, Virginia. 11 years ago. The smell of that study was always the same old paper, leather, and a faint sweetness from the scotch my father kept in the bottom drawer. I had grown up thinking that smell meant safety, that it meant permanence. I was wrong about a lot of things when I was 19, but that was the one that cost me the most. My name is Natalie Hargrove, and I want to be precise about what I found, because precision is the only thing that ever saved me. My father, Robert, ran a mid-sized commercial real estate development firm that my grandfather had built from the ground up in the 70s. When my grandfather passed, he left the company split between my father and my uncle, with a clause in the trust that stipulated a portion of quarterly profits be held in a protected account for his grandchildren, for me and my cousin Delia to access when we each turned 30. It wasn't an enormous fortune, but it was enough. Enough to start something. Enough to matter. I had been helping with bookkeeping at the firm since I was 16, mostly because I had a head for numbers, and my father enjoyed telling his colleagues at the club that his daughter was a natural. What he did not enjoy was the evening I stayed late in the office, 3 weeks before he threw me out, and found the discrepancy. It was small at first. A line item in a subsidiary account that didn't reconcile. The kind of thing a person might miss if they weren't looking carefully. But I was always looking carefully. I pulled the thread and the whole seam came apart. Over the course of 4 years, my father had been redirecting funds from the grandchildren's trust into a series of accounts I didn't recognize. The amounts were never dramatic enough to trigger an automatic audit, but added together, over time, they represented just over $500,000. I went to him privately. I want to be clear about that. I did not go to the board. I did not call a lawyer. I was 19 and he was my father, and some part of me still believed that there had to be an explanation. That the man who had coached my little league team and driven me to my SAT prep every Saturday morning could not have done what those numbers were telling me he had done. He disabused me of that notion in under 10 minutes. He told me the trust had always been his to manage. He told me I had misread the structure. He told me, with a calm that I now recognize as the particular calm of a person who has rehearsed a lie so many times it has become indistinguishable from their own memory, that I was confused and that my confusion was becoming a pattern that worried him deeply. That was when he slid the check across the desk. I walked out of the Hargrove family home for the last time on a Tuesday night in October, with a duffel bag, the clothes on my back, the folded $100 check in my pocket, and no plan beyond the bus station 6 blocks away. The cold that night in Richmond was the kind that gets into the cartilage of your joints and stays there. I sat on a bench outside the station and I did not let myself think about what had just happened, because if I had started thinking, I might not have been able to stop. Instead, I counted things. The number of buses that passed, the number of people who walked by without looking at me, the number of seconds between streetlights blinking on. That was how I met Margaret. She was the woman at the diner across from the bus station, the one who had been watching me from the window for 40 minutes before she finally came outside with a paper cup of tea and sat down on the bench beside me without asking permission. She was in her early 60s, small, with the kind of precise posture that suggested she had spent decades leaning over ledgers. She didn't ask me what was wrong. She asked me if I knew how to read a balance sheet. I told her that I did. She handed me the tea. She said she ran a small forensic accounting firm 2 hours north in a town called Moline, and that she had been trying to fill a junior position for months, and that every candidate she interviewed knew how to use the software, but none of them knew how to actually think. She said she had been watching me sit on that bench doing arithmetic in my head. She could tell by the way my lips moved, and she had decided that I was exactly the kind of person who knew how to think. I asked her why she would offer a job to a stranger on a bench outside a bus station at 11 at night. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "Because someone did it for me once, and I have been waiting ever since to pass it forward." I took the job. I took the tea. I got on a bus to Moline. Her name was Margaret Kowalski, and she ran Kowalski Forensic Accounting Services out of a converted Victorian house with squeaky floors, 3 cats, and a filing system that was entirely her own invention, but that made, once she explained it, absolute and perfect sense. She gave me a room in the house above the office and a salary that was not much but was enough. And she taught me things that no textbook had ever taught me. She taught me that numbers are not neutral, that every financial document tells a story, and that the story always has a narrator, and the narrator always has a motive. She taught me that the most powerful forensic tool available to an investigator is patience. That the people who commit financial crimes almost always believe they have been clever enough, that they almost always relax eventually, and that the moment they relax is the moment they make the error that unravels everything. She also taught me something personal, something she said only once but that I wrote down that same night and have not forgotten. She said, "Natalie, the people who tried to bury you did not understand that you were a seed. I spent the next decade growing. I earned my CPA while working full-time. I passed the CFE exam on my first attempt. I built a reputation in the regional forensic accounting community that eventually attracted the attention of a federal task force investigating complex financial fraud in the Midwest. And when they asked me to consult on a case involving a network of shell companies in 3 states, I delivered findings that resulted in 14 indictments. After that, the calls came from everywhere. By the time I was 28, I had founded my own firm. Kowalski had retired by then. She gifted me her client list and her filing system, and 3 cats who have since multiplied. And I named my firm Meridian Forensic Group, because meridian means the highest point the sun reaches, and because Margaret used to say that every life has one, and the trick is not to miss it. Within 2 years, Meridian had contracts with 3 federal agencies, 2 major insurance carriers, and a list of corporate clients that would have impressed my father if I still cared about impressing my father, which I did not, or told myself I did not. The truth, the one I kept even from Margaret in those early years, was that I had never stopped watching. I was precise about it, clinical. I had a folder encrypted, backed up in 2 places, never printed, that I updated quarterly. My father's firm, the subsidiary accounts, the grandchildren's trust, which still existed on paper but which had been quietly hollowed out over the years in ways that had become more sophisticated as the amounts grew larger. My cousin Delia had turned 32 years ago and tried to access her portion of the trust, and had been told by the family attorney, my father's longtime attorney, that the trust had suffered losses in a market downturn, and that the remaining balance was substantially diminished. Delia had accepted that. She didn't have my particular skill set. I had spent years building a case so airtight it had no seams. I was not ready to use it yet, because I understood something fundamental about leverage. It is worth the most at the moment the other party needs something from you. You don't spend leverage until you know exactly what it will cost them. I found out what it would cost them when Margaret died. She left her estate to a non-profit she had established in her later years, a financial literacy organization for young women aging out of foster care. She left me her house, and she left a note handwritten, 1 page, that said simply, "You were the best investment I ever made. Now go make some of your own." The nonprofit received a substantial anonymous donation the week after her funeral. I didn't tell anyone it was from me. Some things you do because they're right, and because someone once sat down on a bench next to you without being asked, and you understand, finally, what that cost them, and what it meant. The news of Margaret's bequest was reported in a regional magazine, and that article mentioned me, and described Meridian Forensic Group, and noted that I was the sole heir to Margaret's estate, which included the Victorian house and its contents, among which, the journalist noted somewhat breathlessly, was a collection of historical accounting documents that a university archivist had described as potentially quite valuable. That article, I found out later, was the thing that made my father look me up for the first time in 11 years, because my father had done something I had been waiting for him to do. He had gotten lazy. In the year before he appeared in my lobby, he had begun the process of attempting to legally establish that the remaining balance of my grandfather's trust, my portion, the one I had never accessed, the one that had been quietly pillaged for over a decade, had been forfeited due to my estrangement from the family. His attorney had drafted a petition. My father had begun moving the remaining funds into an account controlled by a holding company in Delaware. And he had, because he could not resist the old habits of a man who had always believed his own press, forged a document bearing my signature, releasing my claim to the trust. He had done it badly, I knew, because I had seen the document through a contact at the county recorder's office, and the signature he had used was a scan of my signature from a notarized document I had signed at 17. My handwriting had changed considerably since then, in ways that any competent examiner would notice immediately. My father was not a sophisticated criminal. He was an ordinary man who had made an ordinary series of greedy decisions and had spent 11 years convincing himself that his daughter had disappeared into irrelevance and would never have the standing to come back. He was about to discover that forensic accountants never forget a number, and that seeds, given enough time, become something you cannot uproot. The morning they came to my office, my father arrived in a charcoal suit that had been expensive a few years ago and was now slightly too loose at the shoulders. He walked off the elevator with his second wife, a woman named Patricia, who had been his personal assistant when I was in high school. She was wearing a silk blouse and an expression of studied sympathy, the kind that takes practice. I let them into my office. I had arranged the room carefully. 2 chairs facing my desk, my own chair a few inches higher, a glass of water on each side that I had no intention of touching. These are small things, but small things accumulate. My father looked around the room the way people do when they're surprised by what they find. The city spread out behind me, the clean lines of the furniture, the framed citations on the wall from the federal task forces I had worked with. He composed his expression quickly, the way he always had. He was a man who prided himself on composure. He told me he was glad I was doing well. He said he had thought about reaching out many times over the years. He said he hoped I understood that what had happened between us, he used the phrase, what had happened between us, as though I had also played some equal role in it, had been the result of a difficult time for the whole family, and that he had never stopped thinking of me as his daughter. I let him talk. In my line of work, you learn that silence is the most powerful interview tool available. People feel it. They always feel it. He eventually arrived at the point. He said that with the trust reaching its final disbursement phase, I was turning 30 in 4 months. It was important that the family be aligned on the distribution process. He said there were complexities. He said he wanted to make sure everything was handled properly, and that my interests were protected. Patricia nodded along, her face arranged into something she probably thought looked like warmth. I looked at my father across the desk, the man who had handed me a $100 check and told me to disappear. He hadn't changed as much as I had expected. He had aged, yes, and the looseness in his suit suggested some financial difficulty, but his eyes were the same, that particular quality of attention that was always calculating rather than seeing. I told him I appreciated him coming in. I told him the trust was something I was also in the process of reviewing. I told him I had recently retained a specialist in estate law, and that I looked forward to a transparent and thorough examination of all account activity, going back to the original establishment of the fund. He went very still for about 3 seconds. Then he smiled and said, of course, absolutely. That was exactly the kind of professional approach he had always admired in me. They left 40 minutes later. Patricia shook my hand at the elevator. My father hugged me, a brief, stiff embrace that felt like being contacted by a stranger, and told me to call him. He said we had a lot of catching up to do. I watched the elevator doors close. Then I went back to my desk, opened my encrypted folder, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to my attorney. The second was to a federal contact I had worked with on 3 separate investigations. A woman named Carrie, who specialized in financial fraud, and who owed me a favor from a case 2 years ago that I had helped her close in under 6 weeks. The next 30 days were among the most methodical of my professional life, which is saying something, because my professional life is almost entirely methodical. My attorney filed a request for a full accounting of the trust through the courts. This triggered a mandatory disclosure period, during which my father's attorney, the same attorney who had been managing the trust for 20 years, was required to produce all documentation relating to account activity. What he produced was incomplete. There were gaps. There were transfers that were referenced in later documents but absent from earlier ones. There was the signed release bearing my signature, the one I had never signed. My forensic team went to work on the digital records. It took 4 days to establish that the forged document had been created using a scan of my notarized signature from a court filing in Virginia when I was 17, digitally manipulated, and placed into a document dated 8 months ago. The metadata on the file told the whole story, the way metadata always does, with a precision and honesty that human beings almost never manage. My father had also, in the months since seeing that magazine article, accelerated the movement of funds. He had transferred $340,000, most of what remained of my portion of the trust, into the Delaware holding company. He had then initiated a wire transfer from that company to a personal account in his wife Patricia's name. This was not merely a civil matter anymore. Carrie filed the referral to the U.S. Attorney's office on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, I received an invitation to a charity gala my father was hosting. That Saturday at a hotel in Richmond, a fundraiser for a downtown revitalization initiative that, I had no doubt, was primarily useful to him as a vehicle for rehabilitating his public image among the Richmond business community. The invitation had my name on it, handwritten. He must have added me to the list after our meeting in Chicago. I RSVP'd yes. I drove to Richmond on Friday night and stayed at a hotel that was not the kind of hotel my father and his crowd frequented. On Saturday, I met briefly with Carrie, who confirmed that federal agents would be present at the gala in plain clothes, and that the timing of any action would depend on the outcome of a final document review scheduled for that afternoon. At 7 that evening, I walked into the Meridian Hotel ballroom in Richmond, wearing a black dress that had cost more than the monthly salary of the first job I ever held, and I found a seat near the back where I could see the entire room. My father was at the front, working the crowd with the ease of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. He was good at it, I will give him that. He had a way of making each person he spoke to feel briefly, convincingly, like the most important person in the room. Patricia stood beside him in pale gold, her smile calibrated perfectly. The gala had the usual elements of these things: a cocktail hour, a seated dinner, a program with speeches and a video presentation about the revitalization initiative, complete with architectural renderings and projected economic impact numbers that I noted. Professionally, we're optimistic to the point of being fictional. My father gave a speech. He talked about his family's history in Richmond, about his father's legacy, about the importance of investing in a community's future. He used the word legacy 4 times. He looked confident and comfortable and completely certain that the world was arranged in the way he believed it to be arranged. He hadn't seen me yet. The speeches ended, and the room settled into the ambient noise of dessert and conversation. I stood and walked slowly down the side of the room toward the front. I was perhaps 20 feet away when my father turned from the person he was speaking with and saw me. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction, something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. Not guilt, not shame. Something more primitive than that. Something that looked almost like fear. He recovered immediately. He excused himself from his conversation and came toward me with his arms slightly open, the gesture of a man greeting a guest. I stopped walking when there was still enough distance between us that he couldn't reach me without committing to the gesture in front of the entire room. He stopped too. I told him I had something I wanted to share with him. I kept my voice quiet and pleasant, the tone I use in depositions when I want the other party to feel that we are still in a reasonable conversation. I told him that my team had completed its review of the trust documentation. I told him that we had established, to a legal standard of certainty, the origin and method of the forged release bearing my signature. I told him that the wire transfer records from the Delaware holding company had been turned over to federal investigators. And I told him that Carrie, I used her title, special agent, was in this room right now. Patricia, who had drifted close enough to hear, made a small sound that was not quite a word. My father looked at me for a long moment. The room around us continued its conversations. No one else knew yet what was happening in this small pocket of still air at the front of the ballroom. He said my name. Just my name. In a voice that was, for the first time in my memory, stripped entirely of performance. I reached into my clutch and took out the check. The original $100 check, still folded once. The ink faded to a pale gray-brown, over 11 years. I held it out and he looked at it the way a person looks at something they thought they had erased from the world. I told him the forensic audit of the trust had identified a total of $587,000 in misdirected funds over 14 years. I told him that this included my cousin Delia's portion as well as mine. He started to speak. He used the word misunderstanding. He said the word family. He said the word daughter. I told him I was very good at numbers, and that I had never forgotten a single one. I placed the check on the table beside us, the one with the flower arrangement that was shedding petals onto the white cloth. I placed it flat and smooth, exactly as I had received it, folded once. Then I stepped back and nodded at someone across the room. Carrie and 2 other agents came forward from their separate positions. The room began to notice. Conversations dropped in volume, then fell away entirely in the particular ripple effect that happens when something real interrupts a performance. My father was very still. Patricia had her hand over her mouth. One of the agents spoke to my father in a low voice. My father looked once more at me. His face had a quality I can only describe as collapsed, the structure of it unchanged. The eyes and the jaw and the silver at his temples all in their proper places, but something behind it simply gone. I didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I had spent years expecting I would feel. What I felt was quieter than that. It was the specific sensation of a problem being correctly solved, of a ledger finally, after a very long time, balancing. They let him out through a side door to avoid the full spectacle of the main entrance. Patricia went without being asked, walking beside him with her head down. The room watched in the particular silence of people who are witnessing something they understand is serious, but do not yet have words for. I didn't stay. I had said what I came to say. I walked out through the lobby, and into the Richmond night, which was cold and clear, with the kind of sky that only appears in October, dense with stars, in a way that makes the city feel briefly small and provisional. The case moved through the federal system with the efficiency that financial crimes cases achieve when the documentation is complete. My father was indicted on 4 counts, including wire fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. His attorney negotiated a plea to 2 counts. The sentence was 3 years, with restitution ordered for the full amount of the misdirected funds, including Delia's portion. The Richmond firm, which had been quietly failing for years, dissolved within 6 months of the indictment. The partners who had not known about the fraud, and there were several who genuinely had not, were able to transfer their interest to a competitor. The ones who had known or should have known faced their own proceedings. Patricia filed for divorce before the trial concluded. I used the restitution from my portion of the trust to establish a scholarship fund through Margaret's nonprofit, the one she had founded for young women aging out of foster care. The fund covers professional certification costs, CPA exams, CFE exams, the licenses and credentials that are expensive to obtain, and that make the difference between a person who understands the financial world and a person who is subject to it without recourse. I named it the Kowalski Fund. Margaret would have found that embarrassing. I did it anyway. I drove out to the James River on the morning after the sentencing. It was early, before the joggers and the dog walkers, and the water was low and silver gray in the November light. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the $100 check. It was softer than it had been, almost cloth-like after all those years, the fold line worn to a crease that held its shape from pure memory. I stood at the edge of the bank for a while. I wasn't thinking about my father. I was thinking about Margaret, about the bench outside the bus station, about the paper cup of tea, about the way she had sat down next to me without asking permission, the way people do who understand that sometimes the most important thing you can offer a person is simply your presence at the right moment. I thought about the kids who would take the CFE exam next year with the certification costs covered, about the ones who would learn to read a balance sheet the way I had learned, not just as a professional skill but as a language, the language that the world actually runs on beneath its surface. I let the check go into the water. It didn't flutter dramatically. It just caught the surface of the current and was carried south, turning once, and then it was gone. On the drive back to Chicago, I stopped at a diner and had coffee and read through 12 new case inquiries that had come in while I was in Richmond. There was a financial fraud case in Portland. There was a nonprofit audit in Atlanta. There was a small family business in Ohio with numbers that didn't reconcile, and a daughter who had found the discrepancy and didn't know what to do next. I answered that one first. I told her to document everything, to be precise, to trust what the numbers were telling her, even when the people around her were telling her she was wrong. I told her that numbers are not neutral, that every account tells a story, and that the story always has a narrator, and that the narrator's motive is always somewhere in the data if you are patient enough to find it. I told her she was not alone, because here is what 11 years of forensic accounting has taught me. Beyond the technical skills and the legal standards and the federal statutes, the people who try to use money to erase you have fundamentally misunderstood what you are. They think you are an expense they can cut. They think you are a liability they can transfer. They think you are a line item on a ledger they control. They are wrong. You are the auditor. You are the one with the full record. And when the final reconciliation comes, the one that cannot be forged or manipulated or transferred to a Delaware holding company, the one that is just the true accounting of a life, the balance will not be in their favor. My father gave me $100 and told me to disappear. I built something with that $100 that he could not touch, could not access, and could not understand, because it was built out of the one currency he never valued. The knowledge that I was right, and the patience to prove it. If you have ever been handed a check and told your worth was the number on it, I want you to hear this clearly. That number was not an assessment, it was an error. And errors, given enough time and the right tools, can always be corrected. Please subscribe and share this story. You are not alone in this room. You never were.